Hey guys, welcome to today's video. So I wanted to do a new sort of series about like sculpting 101. So I thought you know, doing a couple of videos on sculpting techniques or materials that I use, even though I've done some videos like that, but mainly more sculpting techniques. So for example, sculpting fur, sculpting eyes, like different expressions with eyes, and so the materials that I use to create the eyes, horns, just stuff, like a whole heap of different things that I do with my art dolls or my masks that I sculpt or my sculptures. So I thought a good video today would be to talk about the armatures that I use for sculpting things. So this goes for both monster clay and polymer clays. So obviously you have to use a couple of different things if you use monster clay or Sculpey or polymer clays. So monster clay obviously is a wax-based clay and it doesn't harden. So it's my favourite thing to sculpt with. I got a nut in my throat. Yeah, so it's my favourite thing to sculpt with is monster clay. I use the medium type. It is quite hard, and when you put it in the microwave it goes quite soft. So an example of monster clay I'm currently working on, well, it's actually on hold, but it's almost finished. A little resin, I'm thinking resin, sculpt of a green tree frog. So I had a pretty good idea of wanting to do a frog, like a chunky frog. So I've been sculpting this. It still needs a bit of texture to it, but I've got the basic shape of what I wanted. But that's an example of what monster clay is, and that will be molded and cast in resin. So molded in silicone and then cast in resin. So I have a really basic molding and casting tutorial in my shop at creaturesandthat.com, if that's something you're interested in. Yeah, so I will get to actually finishing this one day, but anyway, I digress. So basically, with something like this size, I haven't put an armature in it, and also because it's quite small, it doesn't really need an armature. But if I was to sculpt this out of polymer clay, I would probably opt for actually putting an armature inside this main bit, just because it is quite thick, and polymer clay cures or bakes easier if it's thinner. So this would potentially in the middle not cure if it was a solid thick armature, or a solid thick piece, and would need an armature in it. So basically, if you're, I've got a sculpture that I just sculpted. So I have a little video on sculpting this guy. So this is an armature, a sculpture that I sculpted not too long ago. There is a video on my YouTube if you want to know how I sculpted it, and it is in my shop for sale, so check that out if you're interested. But basically, I found an armature that I made a while ago, and it had a basic wolf shape, sort of like that. And basically what I did, I'll try and see if I can find some footage, but I created the armature out of metal. So I wire armature, and basically I made a, you know, a rough shape with the armature using this wire. You can also use copper wire, so wire like this, and you can also use thinner wire if you're doing a smaller one as well. And yeah, just have to play around. Obviously when you're getting to the really big armatures, you'd have to start using things like PVC pipe or steel bars, but that's obviously if you're building something that's huge. It needs to be on a stand so you can work on it. But for something like this, you can easily make a little armature. I have an example on a shoe bill foot that I'm working on. So basically this is the armature for the shoe bill. I've created the main leg bit out of that thicker piece of wire, and then I've also created a smaller foot bit for each toe using that smaller armature that I showed you before. And I've added some polymer clay onto the ends for the nails, and I've also baked them so they're nice and hard, and I can continue sculpting. These ones are actually being sculpted out of Cos clay, so I have half a foot done, but there'll be a video on that coming up. but that is a basic armature of what I've created to make these shoe bill feet. So if you wanted to bulk things out, so for example, if you were sculpting something like this and you wanted to bulk things out so you don't use so much polymer clay here, what I do is I use aluminium foil. So you can basically, with the foil, you can basically sort of wrap it around and sort of mold it to what you want on the piece of wire. So basically you could create a rough shape of what you want, obviously smaller than what you want to sculpt, because then you'll be applying the polymer clay or monster clay on top of this, and then you sculpt away, you know, just building up and everything. So it's pretty much what I did here, building up all of the details with the feet. This area needs to be bulked up a bit more. Obviously they're a bit, this bit of the feet are a bit bigger, and I started off small here, and you can see how I've bulked out this toe here. Obviously still needs a bit more work, and this has been sitting around for a while, so for some reason it's cracking a little bit, but once I get onto that I'll fix it. But so basically, yeah, you want to be bulking out your thicker areas with some aluminium foil. It also easily comes off, and when you bake it in the oven, it's perfectly fine to leave it in, well, you have to leave it in, inside the sculpture piece. So inside this is the wire armature, and obviously the aluminium foil core. So yeah, it bulks it out. You don't have to use as much polymer clay, and it's much easier to bake and cure in the oven. Obviously when you get to smaller bits like this, you need to just have a smaller armature and just work away with that. I'd recommend baking in small areas, so once you're happy with the way one area looks or a basic shape, you can bake that in the oven and then add some more details, so detailing around the neck and stuff, and then it's a good solid core and base for the sculpture, so things won't sag or warp or anything like that. So when you're building a sculpture like this, you do need an armature in it, otherwise it just becomes a bit more difficult to work with and a lot more baking. So yeah, that's for sculptures. For my polymer clay heads, so I'll use this as an example, but it's just a resin head. For heads like this, I did the same process with a aluminium foil ball. So for this one, I basically made a rough shape of the snout bit here and this bit here. So for example, I could probably bend this a little bit. So for example, I'd make a core out of aluminium foil, sort of like that, and it's a real basic shape. I always leave the snout bit a little bit smaller so I can sculpt the details of the nose, because like with the nose area you need to create little holes, and the mouth area you need to sort of dig in a little bit. So I always leave it a little bit smaller, so this would be a good base shape for a flying fox or something with a large head and a small snout. So you can see how it sort of contours towards what the shape of the flying fox is. So you can add the ears at the back and make sure that there's a little bit more room, so you can add the eyes and stuff. So obviously this needs to be contoured towards your animal head, but if you're I always have a reference up on my computer on both sides of the face, so I can compare what my armature looks like against it and make sure that it's a good size and a good shape for applying all of the other texture on it. So I did that for polymer clay and also monster clay. So for the monster clay, I have a used one. For the monster clay, goodbye, I use the same deal with a, oh my god, I just tipped my bin over and there's crap everywhere. For the monster clay, I use the aluminium ball again, and I reuse it, and as you can see, the monster clay will get stuck inside all the crevices of the ball, but that's fine because it melts and you can you know, reuse it. So yes, I've used this quite a few times and I just keep reusing it. So it's always good when you're using monster clay that you can reuse your armatures. And I really only use that for just the heads that I sculpt and I'm going to cast. And it doesn't really matter with monster clay because if you use an armature or not, I find it easier to use an armature because working with soft monster clay tends to be a bit sloppy. It just depends how big the head is. So for this one, I originally sculpted this out of monster clay and I didn't use an armature for it because it's quite a small head. And I find sometimes it's a bit more time consuming when I'm sculpting using an armature, something this small. And sometimes I find a block when, you know, I start subtractive carving and then I run into the armature piece. So for something this small and you're using monster clay, you don't really need an armature. Just be careful of having really soft monster clay because it will sort of warp and melt. So but the good thing is it goes hard pretty quickly and you can make it soft again as well. So monster clay, that's why I like working with it. I like working with softer clays, but if I were to do this in polymer clay, I'd make a small armature for the middle bit here. For the feet, I don't really do much armature work in feet things because they're quite small. So feet's like this. I wouldn't make an armature obviously because it's too small to have one and you need to sort of be able to sculpt in and carve some detailing into that, so I probably wouldn't. For my shoe bill, this one's a little bit different because it's got a movable jaw. So for the shoe bill, what I did was I actually sculpted the beak. This will come in a video when I eventually get around to working on it again, but it will be in a video of how I did the beak. But for the beak, I did use an aluminium foil ball, and that was to create the ridge of the beak because it is such a large beak, and it needed something to be able to fit under here. So what I did was I sculpted on top of a aluminium ball like that, so I could achieve the roundness of the beak and give it some stability when I was carving it and baking it. And then I just went ahead and smoothed this all out, carved it up, and anything that I found needed to be smooth, I just added some more polymer clay into it. And that's basically how I did that. Inside is also, I can't remember what I did inside. I don't think there's much of an armature inside, just because with this movable jaw it's quite thin, so you can see there's not a lot of room for armature here. And then that was also I needed to be able to subtractive carve and do the eyes, embed the eyes in it, so there's not a lot of room to add that armature. There's a little bit of an armature in here just to bulk things out and keep it a bit more stable. That is a wooden, it's a wooden thing, little teddy bear joint, so that's to make it a little bit more sturdy. But that wasn't really necessary. I was playing around with a couple of different movable jaw options, but I found a way that I'm really happy with. So that movable jaw will be a tutorial later at this stage. I don't have the time to create it, but there will be one. So yeah, so this one doesn't really have much of an armature in it. I wouldn't recommend using anything plastic if you're going to bake it in the oven because it will melt. Or anything foam or something like that that will be warped or changed by heat, so I wouldn't really recommend doing it. That's why aluminium foil works really well for armatures. If you're sculpting masks, for example, you'll need a form, like a head form. So you can either buy a head form. It's not 100% amazing because it is on the smaller side, so people with larger heads, sometimes your masks won't fit them, so it's always good to get average sized heads. So you can either buy a foam form or cast your own headpiece out of plaster and yeah, try and get someone with a larger head to be your dummy. But I personally, I'm still learning how to create masks, so I bought a form from Monster Makers, and the same people that make monster clay, so they have a female head form and a male head form. The female, I wouldn't really recommend that form because it is quite small, so I went for the male form. I think his name's Ed Head, I think it is. So I've still got a mask on the form, but basically this is the form. It's got on the face area, it's got the shape of a face, but this is the male form, and it's just made out of foam, so it's reusable and pretty light. Yeah, Ed Head, so it's Ed Head by Monster Makers. You can find it at monstermakers.com, not spons. But basically it gives you a rough area of where all of the features are. So it's got the features of the ears, they're really rough, and where the eyes are. So basically where the eyes are, there's a little feature of the eyes, obviously the nose, and where the mouth area is. So I sculpted this honey mask on top of the Ed Head. I'm going to be doing a Tengu mask soon in the future when I can. So that's why I've left this on, because it's a good base to sculpt off. So basically when I sculpt the Tengu mask, I'll just sort of refine it a bit more and just change a few things like the nose area, probably not so much the eyes because I like the way the eyes are, but definitely will change the eyes and maybe some overall shape on the mouth. I want it to be a bit more pointy. So that's why I've left this on top of the Ed Head. It probably is a little bit hard to get off now that it's been on there for a little while, but there's nothing a heat gun can't do. It'll make it soft and you can peel it off. But this is, I think this is a good form for beginners. Like I said, I'm a beginner and still learning how to use mask forms or head forms to sculpt masks, and this one is quite light. Obviously if you get a plaster one, it will be a lot heavier. It's also hollow, so you can stick it on a pole or something if you like to sculpt higher up. So I highly recommend getting one of these Ed Heads. They're about, I think they're around 150, 200 bucks. But yeah, if you're learning to sculpt masks, it's really worthwhile because instead of trying to mold or get a head cast of someone, if you're just learning, at least you got something to begin with. I'm sure you can find head casts somewhere, but you'll be paying quite a lot for it. But yeah, so this is a really good option if you're looking for something that is a bit smaller. But yeah. Yeah, so I'd recommend using the Ed Head and not the, I forgot what the female form is. But I think this is an overall good basic looking head for a form. I know there's also taxidermy forms you can get, but that's obviously if you're going to be sculpting stuff. I wouldn't recommend putting polymer clay on it, just because you need to put that in the oven, and I'm pretty sure those forms are made of foam, so oven and foam, no good. Don't mix. But yeah, that's pretty much all of the armatures that I use. I've rambled on for 18 minutes. Oh my god, it was meant to be like a 5-minute video. But yeah, I hope that is a little bit more informative of what type of forms that I use and armatures that I use to sculpt. If you have any questions, leave it in the comments. I'll try and answer them as well. And yeah, so if you want a little more, you can join my Patreon. I have heaps of stuff over there as well, and exclusive access to things, printables, and also exclusive videos. And you can also have one of my tiers also is a little question thing, so you can ask me questions about anything and I'll sort of guide you through anything of that or answer them. So that is over there if you want a little bit more guidance and if you're just starting out. And thanks to my patrons for supporting me so far. It's really great. I really appreciate it, and yeah, hopefully I can get a few more things up for you this month. So yeah, anyway, you can check me out on Instagram, Facebook, Creatures of the Nat, and my shop, creaturesofnat.com, and I'll catch you in the next one. Bye!